Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Chapter 14, the Civil War. Today we're going to be continuing our study in our um, Unfinished Nation textbook and going through our notes and our PowerPoints. Hopefully you guys are keeping up with your notes and keeping up with all the vocabulary so that you will understand what we're doing as we go through this. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is secession. So when we left off in Chapter 13, Abraham Lincoln had just been elected president, and essentially what's going to happen is once Lincoln wins the election, you're going to see immediately South Carolina secede from the Union. So December 20th, 1860, following the election results, South Carolina votes to secede. 6 other states are going to follow by March 4th of 1861. And President Buchanan did little to stop the secession. He was kind of a lame duck, especially towards the end of his presidency. Okay, and that just means essentially they didn't do anything. They were just kind of a figurehead. Okay. As we continue, I can't think of what his position was. I believe he was the senator. But John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed essentially a new constitutional amendment that would guarantee slavery where it was, and also reestablished the Missouri Compromise line in all the U.S. territory. So essentially that, it would extend all the way to the Pacific. The problem is that the Senate wasn't willing to approve this, and he was a senator. Couldn't think of it there for a second. The Southerners seemed willing to accept the plan, those that were left with the compromise. The problem was that they couldn't find any common ground between the North and the South. And essentially, politicians are going to trigger the kind of the Civil War's continuance. So essentially, you've got a lot of issues here that are starting to kind of rear its head. And, this has been a long time coming with all the sectionalism that we've talked about over the course of the semester. But Republicans did not support the plan, as I mentioned, that's Northerners, because a key part of their platform was the non-extension of slavery. And even under this compromise, essentially, it was going to allow slavery to kind of expand underneath that Missouri Compromise line. Now, we come to one of the first battles of the Civil War at Fort Sumter. Confederate leaders ordered the capture of the fort. On April 12th, firing began, and on the 14th, the fort surrendered. Now, no one actually was killed in this fighting, but it was the beginning of the war, and the South was successful in this battle. Now, you got to remember that when South Carolina seceded, North Carolina won't secede for another period of time, but South Carolina is kind of the heart of the South there. As Lincoln mobilized for war, 4 more Southern states withdrew. And essentially, you had 4 states that remained in between the North and the seceding states. And that you can see here, we call those border states. So Maryland, okay, Kentucky, Missouri, and then Delaware. Okay. All right. And it's also an important note here at the beginning of the war, Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. I think one of the misconceptions that we get a lot of times is that Lincoln was out to end slavery. Really, Lincoln was just trying to keep the country together. And you can understand, as a president, you don't want to be the president that allowed the country to split. Unfortunately, it wasn't really his fault. It was the 4 presidents prior that pretty much did nothing to stop sectionalism. And there's a reason that we don't talk about those presidents very often. Now, some of the northern advantages, and we're going to go ahead and put these up. The North had a larger population, 2 times as much as the South, a lot more industry, and a ton more ability to produce war machines, if you want to call it that. But more specifically, bullets, ammunition, food, clothing, all the things that come from having an industrialized society, as well as they also had the infrastructure because of the train to actually transport these materials. Some Southern advantages, fighting a very defensive war. They knew the land better. Most of this fighting, except for just a few battles, is going to be fought in the South. Most of the population in the South that was white was united, and they had better military leadership. Many of the generals who had been a part of the Union sided with the Confederacy, and it's going to leave the North with a lot of instability as far as leadership. Both the North and the South mobilized their economies to fight the war, and you saw some controversy here, especially in the border states and even in some in like Virginia. When um, Virginia kind of decides to secede, there's this idea that Robert E. Lee is going to have to kind of pick what side is he going to fight on. And Robert E. Lee had the opportunity actually to fight for the Union, but he said he could not fight against his brothers in Virginia. So you just see there's a lot of this very personal war and something that's going to be a problem kind of going forward. All right, we're going to go ahead and put these up here as much as we can. Some of the economics during the war in 1862, and these two are very important. The Homestead Act was passed providing 160 acres of land for settlers to move west for a small fee after 5 years. It's very important to understand that this is going to very much push folks westward. And one of the ideas behind this was pushing those who were in the Union westward to establish a free land and to kind of put people out there who would support the Union versus that of the Confederacy. I don't know that that was the only real motivation, but it is a motivation of one kind. The Homestead Act is going to prove as one of the more important acts of legislation that comes out during this period. The second is the Morrill Land Grant, which was where the federal government actually gave land to states to use for financing education. And this is going to lead to new colleges and universities forming, gives states more power to develop, the quality of education that they're giving in their state and the quality of the education to their citizens. Tariffs were raised to the highest level in history to that point, trying to encourage taxes to help fund the war. We're going to see the first draft in American history during this time. And Republicans dominated Congress with the South seceding. They lost their influence in the country. So you have to understand the Confederacy was a completely different country. And these Republicans wanted to raise the tariff rates. You also see railroad subsidies for Transcontinental Railroad. Union Pacific and Central Pacific met in 1869 to actually join the railroads. And then National Bank Acts, where banks could join and issue treasury notes. So essentially, you're seeing a lot of various additions to the country now where they're trying to make money. Now, obviously, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad meeting, that's after the war. But you're going to start seeing these companies develop that are helping build the Transcontinental Railroad westward and eastward until they meet. Now, how did the country finance the war? Okay, they did it through taxes, and that's how we always finance wars. Now, we already talked about the draft. Talking about conscription, Congress instituted a draft of basically where they could go and force you to fight in the war. Wealthy individuals could hire substitutes for $300, which only made the Civil War look as if it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Essentially saying that poor folks were the ones who were getting kind of the bad end of this deal. Now, in New York City, you see draft riots. Over 100 plus were dead in 4 days. And because of this, executive power begins to increase drastically. Lincoln is forced to send troops into battle and increase the military size without congressional approval. You're also going to see Lincoln kind of do some things in the border states that are considered a little bit dodgy in some people's eyes, specifically suspending habeas corpus, essentially evidence in those states in order to arrest someone. He also shut down newspapers in Maryland. And essentially what you have here is they're trying to maintain control in the border states. They do allow slavery in the border states during this time because they wanted those states to stay kind of neutral to the Confederacy. If those states had joined the Confederacy, it would have given the Confederacy even more power and even more of a buffer from the military in the Union. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln runs against George McClellan, who had been a former Union general who Lincoln had actually fired. And McClellan was fired for his lack of administration and lack of decision making. And Abraham Lincoln goes through a lot of generals during the Civil War. Something to study when you go back and look at it for sure. But specifically, he didn't trust any of the men that were leading his military. Lincoln won the electoral vote in a landslide. However, it ended up being a close popular vote. McClellan was actually able to carry quite a few votes across the nation. All right. Now, one of the things that comes during this time, the idea of early emancipation. In 1861, the Confiscation Act was passed. Slaves were used in Southern military effort, would be considered free. So if they fought for the Confederacy, those slaves were free as kind of an idea to kind of get those slaves to jump ship and not fight for their masters. In 1862, the law abolished slavery in D.C. In Confiscation Act in 1862, the president could use freed slaves as soldiers. Now, the issue with that is that in using those slaves as soldiers, in some ways they were still treating African Americans as if they were just property, but it at least did give the African Americans a chance who were slaves to fight for a group that cared. Now, Abraham Lincoln is going to write the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order to free all slaves in the areas of the Confederacy that were in rebellion. This is going to eventually become a constitutional amendment. It did not include the areas under the Union control nor the border states, mainly because the Emancipation Proclamation really was more of a, I don't want to call it, it wasn't a fake document because that's not the right word. It was more of a ceremonial document in a lot of ways because the Confederacy was its own country, and essentially they're issuing an order for a country they're at war with. It was important, and it's important that it was written because it does change the course of American history for sure. But the actual constitutional amendment is what changes America. But it did change the war effort to end slavery in addition to preserving the Union. That was one of the big other things there with the Emancipation Proclamation, is that it gave another cause to the Union for fighting. It helped keep Europeans as well from siding on behalf of the South because many Europeans were relying on Southern cotton, and there was a point in the war in which the United States was really afraid that Great Britain or France or Spain or someone would join the Confederacy as a chance to overthrow the United States government. However, that never happened. Now, African Americans during the war escaped. They were considered contraband and would not be returned to the Confederacy. Black enlistment increased post-Emancipation Proclamation. We see that in the 54th Massachusetts and the all African American regiment that forms. They fought for the North, and if you ever watch the movie Glory, which is a great movie, a lot of great actors, it kind of gives you that background story. Unfortunately, black soldiers were paid less and often were forced to do arduous manual labor and not allowed to fight, even though eventually the 54th Massachusetts Regiment did get to fight. Women did serve in the war. Most were in the nursing field, but this was kind of an advancement for women. In 1863, the National Women's Loyal League was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they hoped to eliminate slavery and gain women's suffrage. So one of the things that you see from Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony is that they tied, when we go to the National Women's Suffrage Conference there in 1848, and they issued the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. For the next 15 years, and really the next 20 years, and then even past that, the freedom of African Americans was tied to women's suffrage. So women saw the plight of African Americans as kind of their own plight in that they were held back and not treated as equals. Unfortunately, when the slaves are freed, they don't do anything about women's suffrage. They just kind of leave them there without a cause. So then, as we continue, you see women who are advocating for their rights, trying to tie their cause to something else bigger, as kind of trying to just get to where they would be considered. Now, the government of the Confederacy was pretty weak in regards to an actual government. Most of the power resided in the states, but their president was Jefferson Davis, their vice president Alexander Stephens. There was no uniform currency system, which led to high inflation, somewhere around 9,000% during the war, which means that they don't have a national bank, they don't have any of this infrastructure. think about Articles of the Confederation back in 1700s, whenever we were trying to form the United States and we were in the middle of the Revolutionary War. Same situation. And now you've got no government at all. Federal government authorized the impressment of slaves and a food draft, essentially that they could just take slaves for the military effort and that they could, quote unquote, take food from where they needed it. The role of Southern women also changed drastically during this time. Wives were put in charge of farming. His husband's fault, which gave women a little more power in the South than they'd ever had. Widowed women had to find jobs to support themselves and their families. And so you see the Confederacy and the Civil War is kind of a step for women's rights in some ways because uh, it gave women an opportunity to have more responsibility, etc. Problem is that when the war is over, women are put right back in that same sphere of domesticity that they were stuck in. Now, the South had much better leadership than the North, which we talked about. Ulysses S. Grant was not in charge of the war effort until March of 1864, and he was a very good leader and will become a future president. The Northern Navy was vastly superior to that of the Southern Navy, and they tried to blockade the South. And what happens here is Lincoln had turned at the beginning of the war to Winfield Scott, who was a 74-year-old war hero from the Mexican-American War. You may remember us talking about him. He contributed strategic advice that essentially kind of was this anaconda plan that they needed to cut off the South and surround them and blockade them from the rest of the world, essentially starve them out, kind of like a snake wraps around its prey and sucks out the life. Lincoln forced to turn to George McClellan. George McClellan seemed too slow to act for Lincoln's taste. That's why Lincoln fired him. And essentially, following that time, Lincoln had no chief of staff after he let McClellan go. And essentially keeps appointing generals until he finally finds a general he can trust in Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant was a solid leader. But the Navy did try to blockade the South, and they aided in the transportation of supplies and troops along with the railroads. Another great topic to go study is the blockade runners in the East Coast there of the South. Those were the Confederate ships that were sailing to Europe and back with supplies, and they would sail in the dark and sail at night when it's very dangerous, and a really, really cool story. Now, over the course of the war, we have some key battles. Over 618,000 Americans died in the war. One of the key, not keyest, I know where I'm going with that. One of the most important battles there, Antietam, which was one of the bloodiest days of the war, which also led to the Emancipation Proclamation because Lincoln saw the change it needed. Gettysburg, July 1st through the 3rd in 1863, which was one of the only wars that, or one of the only battles to really ever take place, one of the major battles, I should say, ever take place in the North. And then that led to the Gettysburg Address, which was issued on November 19, 1863, where Lincoln dedicated the battlefield as a cemetery, referencing the Declaration of Independence for country and for what needed to change. It's also the 7 years ago, which was 87 years ago to that day. We were highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. One of the most quoted speeches in history, and by far something that you need to consider looking deeper into if you have time. Your book did a really good job of going through and talk about the Battle of Bull Run, which we're not going to get to talk about. Let's see. Talks a little bit about the West, which we don't really ever talk about in this class, or I have not in the past. Also talks about the Virginia front with Thomas Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson, as he is known. And you can read through some of those battles if you would like to know more about specifics. But we're, like I said, we're kind of doing an overview here. You need to read about Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Battle of Chattanooga. Okay. And then the last one we're going to leave here is Sherman's March to the Sea. And Sherman's March to the Sea was a march through essentially the southern half of the Confederacy. Sherman left Atlanta, marching through Georgia, and essentially desolated all of the land and supplies of the South. That was the idea. It's also known as the oh, I can't think of the name. Not burn. Anywho, you can look it up. It's got another nickname, but essentially he destroyed all of Georgia and much of the South there. There's actually quite a bit of reconstruction that had to be done there in that specific part of the Confederacy when the war's over, because um, he destroyed a lot of landmarks, like places that would still be standing today that would be historical, um, places to go visit. He absolutely decimated. And then Appomattox Courthouse is the final kind of main part of the war where General Lee surrenders on April 9th of 1865. Okay, so I know I went through that kind of quick, but like I've told you before in this class, you guys need to do your own reading a lot of times, and you need to keep up with um, some of these details that I can't give you in class. Go back and read. And we've already talked about a lot of those things in American One. So that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully you don't have any questions, but if you do, feel free to ask me. Make sure you're reading through your text after you've completed this PowerPoint. That will help you, kind of pick up what we've talked about, as well as kind of fill in some of the gaps there and understanding the war. All right, that's all I've got for you today. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.